Welcome to session 326 of the Bible in a Year commentary. If you started this series on the 1st of January, then today should be the 22nd of November. Today we'll be looking at 1 Timothy 1-2 and Psalm 16. But first of all, let's get an overview of 1 Timothy. We move now from letters to churches to letters to leaders of churches. These are known as the pastoral epistles, as they focus on teaching specific individuals about their pastoral responsibilities as leaders in the church. This includes 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. 1 Timothy is traditionally said to have been written by Paul while in prison in Rome around 64 CE, to Timothy, who was leading a church in Ephesus. Some scholars argue for a later date, sometime in the early 100s CE. Like other disputed letters, they would suggest this was a letter written by a disciple of Paul as a thought experiment of what would Paul teach a young pastor leading a church. We met Timothy in Acts 16 as a young man, son of a Jewish mother and a Greek father. He joined Paul in his mission trips and became a key member of Paul's team. Many of Paul's letters mention Timothy. See 2 Corinthians 1 verse 1, Philippians 1 verse 1, Colossians 1 verse 1, and 1 Thessalonians 1 verse 1. At some point later in Paul's ministry, he sent Timothy to pastor the church in Ephesus, which is where we now find him. Here is a summary of the structure, but I would recommend checking out the written version of this commentary in the description to see the structure properly for yourself, particularly as today there are two. But we start with the first half, 1 Timothy 1-3, instructions for the church in Ephesus. And this can be broken up into 1 Timothy 1, the false teachings versus faithful ministry. 1 Timothy 2, verses 1-8, instructions on prayer. 2, verses 9-15, instructions for women in the church. And 3, instructions for leaders in the church. We then have the second half, 1 Timothy 4-6, which is the instructions specifically for Timothy. These can be broken up into 1 Timothy 4, Timothy's leadership. 1 Timothy 5, verses 1-6, verses 2, instructions on handling different members of the church, and then 1 Timothy 6, verses 3-21, the final warnings and instructions. A key struggle that Timothy is facing is false teaching, much like elsewhere. This teaching is working its way through the church and impacting many areas of church life. Paul gives Timothy guidance for handling this false teaching and criteria for establishing good leaders in the church while weeding out the bad ones. Along with this comes teaching for Timothy on how to lead well. Paul includes guidance on how to handle different members of the church, to pastor them, and to strengthen the church as a whole. But let's jump into today's reading. Paul opens with the usual greetings, but immediately we can see the tone of this letter. Paul calls Timothy his loyal child in the faith. That's 1 Timothy 1 verse 2. We've seen the care and love that Paul has had for the churches in the previous letters. How much more love would Paul have for this young man that he has seen grow up, who has followed him from church to church and suffered and struggled alongside him? Paul then cuts straight to the chase. He reminds Timothy of why he was sent to Ephesus in the first place, to instruct certain people to not teach any different doctrine. That's 1 Timothy 1 verse 3. These teachers were getting caught up looking for special teaching. This would have been an early form of what would become known as Gnosticism. Gnosticism is the belief that true believers are those that identify and find secret, hidden knowledge. In short, they're caught up in trying to be clever. Paul tells Timothy that instead the goal should be divine training that is known by faith. That's 1 Timothy 1 verse 4. In other words, salvation doesn't come from knowing secret things that come from being super smart. It comes from formational habits and living that comes from faith. All teaching should come from a place of love, pureness of heart, and sincere faith. It should seek the best of the people that it is teaching. Paul identifies some have moved away from this to the teaching that is just meaningless talk. They want the position and the influence that comes from being teachers, but they've completely misunderstood the importance and the significance of what they are teaching. The fact that Paul describes them as teachers of the law suggests that, as we've seen elsewhere, there are some that are trying to force their believers in Ephesus to follow set Jewish laws. So Paul addresses the law in a much more nuanced way than we've seen before. Here Paul argues that the law has value if used well. It's not there for those who already are in the habit of doing right. Instead, it's there for those who aren't. He then lists examples of behaviours that would benefit from the law. Let's take a moment to unpack that. We've gathered from other letters that the law is useless as a means for salvation, but it was initially brought in to be a guide for God's people to help them avoid indulging sin and being shaped by it. The model we've looked at in previous letters points to the deciding factor on how we should live is weighing up, is this indulging sin and allowing us to be shaped in its image, or is it indulging the Spirit and allowing us to be shaped in the image of Jesus? But this requires a level of maturity and wisdom, which someone still very trapped in the grips of sin is likely to lack. So it may be that the law is useful as a stopgap for those who are very much still caught up in their sin. It curbs their behaviours temporarily so that they stop indulging sin, and so the work of the Spirit can start to shape them and unravel the power of sin in their life. Then, when they are more stable and less controlled by their sin, they can begin to lean less on the law and more on the wisdom of Spirit. Paul believes this wisdom and how to use the law is from God. Paul then points to himself as an example of a better way. He is grateful to Jesus and how he has kept them in the ministry that he has appointed Paul to. Paul used to be a wicked man, denying the power of Jesus and persecuting believers with violence. But God had mercy on Paul, transforming him with faith and love through Jesus. Paul is the perfect example that Jesus came to save and transform sinners and has the power to do so. In fact, Paul serves as an example of what Jesus can do for all people because of his patience. For Timothy, the person to learn from here is not Paul, but Jesus. Just as Jesus has had patience and mercy on Paul and shaped him with faith and love into the man he now is, Timothy should have patience and mercy with the sinners in his church. He should shape them with faith and love. Paul then encourages Timothy. He is giving Timothy these instructions because Timothy has had many prophetic words spoken over him about being a leader of God's people. Paul wants to encourage Timothy in these prophetic words that he might continue to do well in what he has been called to fight the good fight. That will require faith and good conscience in order to stay strong. Paul points to those who have abandoned their good conscience, Hymenaeus and Alexander. They have left the faith, and Paul has given them over to Satan in the hope that they learn the error of their ways. Next, Paul switches to talking about the order in the church. He begins by encouraging all to pray for one another. And that might be praying on behalf of someone or praying to give thanks for someone. This includes leaders and those in authority. Paul argues that believers should do this so that many live quiet and peaceable lives. That's 1 Timothy 2 verse 2. And the reason for this is likely because there were men who were getting into arguments and disagreeing with one another in anger. It's hard to hold on to your anger for someone when you are genuinely praying for them regularly. Paul reminds Timothy that it's Jesus' desire that all are saved, and Jesus was given for all. So Paul encourages these angry men to pray instead. Paul then switches to the women, saying that they should dress themselves modestly. This isn't modesty in the terms of how we view modesty today. Modesty today is often used to refer to the idea of not showing too much skin. In the Greco-Roman world, modesty meant not flashy or showy. Many of the rich women in the church were wearing lots of expensive clothing and jewelry. This was causing division in the church as these women are showing off their wealth when many in the church are very poor. We then get a controversial passage where Paul tells Timothy that women should learn in silence and should not teach or have authority over a man. As evidence for this, Paul points to Adam and Eve. Some read this as an argument that women should never teach or have authority over men. As we've read so far, this doesn't seem to line up with Paul's other teaching, where it is expected that women would not be silent but pray and prophesy in church. Have a look at 1 Corinthians 11 verse 5. It also doesn't fit with the idea that Jesus came to do away with law. If he came to do away with law, why are we now applying new laws that are even more restrictive over women? It seems more likely then that Paul was talking specifically about the women in the church of Ephesus. These women were more likely to be uneducated, and if they're parroting what the male false teachers are saying, then they're going to be causing issues. This may be then why Paul points to Adam and Eve as evidence. Just as Eve did not know better and was easily convinced by the serpent, these Ephesian women don't know better and are easily convinced by false teachers. This leaves us with a difficult verse, yet you'll be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty. That's 1 Timothy 2 verse 15. There is great debate over what this means, because even the most culturally conservative Christians have to face the fact that an on-the-face reading of this verse suggests that women aren't saved by faith but by having children, which is incompatible with the gospel message Paul has been sharing. There are two key points to focus on. First, it says she will be saved, not they will be saved. This suggests that Paul is still talking about Eve, not women in general. Then there's the saved part. Some point to the fact that through childbirth, Eve continued the line that would eventually culminate in Jesus, and through Jesus, all are saved. There are a lot of unknowns, and most interpretations will leave some unsatisfied. It's a difficult passage. But that's 1 Timothy 1-2. Now let's look at Psalm 16. This psalm is attributed to King David and falls into the category of trust psalm. These psalms sing of confidence in who God is. Here is a summary of the structure. With verses 1-2, the Lord my refuge. Verse 3-4, contrast between those who are committed to the Lord and those who worship other gods. Verses 5-6, the Lord my portion. Verses 7-8, the Lord my comfort. And then verses 9-11, the Lord my joy. The psalm opens with the psalmist laying out their stall, so to speak. God is the one that they trust in. And as far as they are concerned, there is nothing good that can be found outside of God. Those that are equally faithful to God are an encouragement to the psalmist. But those that choose to worship other gods choose a way of sorrow. The psalmist will never make offerings to other gods or speak their names. He wants nothing to do with them. And so he sets his eyes back on the Lord. The Lord is our portion and inheritance. For an Israelite, being a follower of God was part of their inheritance. Just like someone enjoys wealth or property being handed down to them, the Israelites see their faith as a blessing that they inherit. This is also true for us as Christians. This access to God is something we inherit as adopted children of God. The Lord is our comfort. When we are unsure or struggling, it is the Lord who comforts and advises us. He goes before us, protecting us and holding us stable, even when it feels like we're unstable. This promise, Psalm 16 verse 10, is picked up in the New Testament when they talk about Jesus' resurrection. God did not abandon Jesus to death, but restored him to life. See Acts 2 verses 25 to 28 and 13 verse 35. Because of all of this, the Lord is our joy. We have a security that God won't abandon us. He offers us life. His very presence is a source of joy. Thanks for joining us today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've read and share your thoughts or questions below. If you're watching in the future, then you can click here for the next session, or you can find the full playlist just down here. To receive these daily commentaries in your email inbox, subscribe via the link in the description below. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.